Guys, I recently went to and had the honor of attending Dragonsteel Nexus, where basically it's a convention for Brandon Sanderson fans, but it also was a convention for fans of the fantasy and sci-fi genres in general. And I learned so much, also had so much fun, and I just want to show you real quick. I'm wearing my World Hopper t-shirt. It's got so many details on it. Okay, anyway. I had so much fun. I went with one of my siblings and we seriously had like a blast, but I also was like so pleasantly surprised by the content and the learning I got out of every single panel I went to. Most of the panels I went to. There were some where I was reading Wind and Truth and not listening to the panelists, and that's no hate to them, no shade. I was just so excited to read. I wanted to make a video about the writing advice I received at Dragonsteel Nexus. It was informative and fun and just like really enjoyable to talk about. I'm gonna kind of separate each panel since they talk about different content, but I think the first panel that we went to was about diversity in fantasy and was in the Nalthis room. It was so fun. Each room was named after a world. It was like a vibe. But in the Nalthis room, where we're talking about diversity in fantasy, it was just such a cool group of people, a very good environment. I could just feel like everyone's willingness to like learn from each other. And all the panelists like had excellent advice and little things. And I want to start with that because I feel like that's incredibly important. And being a cis white writer, it makes sense that I should probably learn about diversity in fantasy, though I think it benefits everybody. There was this discussion right from the beginning about how important diversity is and representation specifically in all stories, but especially in fantasy. Some of them talked about the diversity in culture, kind of breaking away from medieval knights and the things that have sort of been repeated again and again in stories. And some of them talked about what it was like seeing their own culture or their own experiences on screen in books, whether it be due to disability or race or gender expression or sexual identity. It all was just emphasized that when you see yourself in that, you also feel like you can do the amazing things that the characters do. Something they emphasized as like a huge don't in your writing is to not make a marginalized group or the bad guy. Specifically in your story, if you have a group of people who are marginalized, even if it's a made-up world, then to make them the bad guy sends a message in a lot of ways that you perceive that which is unfamiliar or different from you to be dangerous or just basically racist, homophobic, xenophobic nonsense. Don't write that in your stories. But it's good to ask yourself, why is your villain, your antagonist, your antagonist? What is it about them that makes them the villain? And does it have anything to do with their race or sexual identity? And maybe it shouldn't. They talked about how being marginalized or disabled is not like this thing to overcome. I think a lot of the time we write characters who achieve a certain level of like what is perceived to be normalcy, when in reality the true conquering that should happen in stories is largely about acceptance and characters, and therefore people reading about themselves feeling like they don't need to overcome the things that are just true and important about them. I thought that was very helpful for me. It actually gave me perspective on a story I've been working on for a long time, like the main one that I've had my focus on, this trilogy, and I discussed it with my sister, and we were both thinking like, oh, maybe a certain character should do something else, or maybe this should be written differently based on how I wrote it and my accidental biases. So yeah, I could definitely learn a thing or two, and I want to just say, if you feel like defensive about this kind of topic, just take a minute and ask yourself why, and listen and learn from people like this. There are more than just like a panel at Dragonsteel that you can learn from. I also got a lot of really great writing advice from some well-known authors. Specifically, I know the names of Fonda Lee and Robin Hobb, women I admire, who I actually haven't ever read anything of, but like now I'm definitely going to. I already was. They're on my list, but you know. And then I feel so bad because I do know his name and I have seen his books around and I have been interested, and like booktubers have recommended his books. But in talking about writing captivating characters, I'm pretty sure I only got his first name, and even then I'm not sure. I think his name is Brian. You can tell how poorly I take notes. I was just so excited. I was taking notes of my little World Hopper passport that they gave us. And I was like, yes, amazing. And then I was like, what was his name? Because I would specify that it was Brian, but who's Brian? Anyway, so Brian, I'm sorry. And if that's not your name, that's hilarious. But in the Writing Captivating Characters panel, I kind of summarized like what the different panelists said. I think he actually, one of the first things that I wrote down, I'm pretty sure he quoted Dan Wells. And if you don't know Dan Wells, he's like a friend and co-worker of Sanderson. They do their podcast together. He's an author. He writes a lot of horror, and I also haven't read anything of his. But he's funny. He also is a troll. He trolled a lot. He said, I heart Moash. He wore a shirt that said, I heart Moash. So the fact that I'm like quoting him in this thing, yeah, take that with a grain of salt. I don't heart Moash. I thumbs down Moash, okay? He's the worst. Storm Moash, as we learned to say, because there were children present, and some people did not say Storm Moash, which was very funny. Anyway, so Dan Wells is quoted in this panel. He was not at this panel, but he said something that I liked and I think is helpful if you're wanting to motivate characters to basically say that every character should be chasing something and be chased by something. So it doesn't necessarily mean a monster needs to be chasing them and they're hunting a monster, right? But the concept of like they're in pursuit of something, they have a motivation or a desire, and something, whether it be their past or a flaw or a monster, is chasing them. He also made the point that readers can tell when you're trying to be in control. So to just kind of let it go a little bit. Also, like I said, I clung to Robin Hobb and Fonda Lee's advice in this panel and in another one. So Fonda Lee, I kind of summed up a lot of the things that she said about writing captivating characters. She said to, somewhere where she might start is writing a broad strokes archetype of a character. Something kind of structurally, it's there, it's familiar, but then putting them through a filter of their relationships with other people and getting to know the characters that way. Also kind of like an actor moving through steps and getting to know their own characters. A similar concept is kind of how she explained it. And I like that because I think sometimes we're worried about writing way specific, unique characters who are unique to a point of we're so worried about how special they are when we forget that we're also writing people, and people are kind of archetypal a lot of the time, and we have habits and similarities, and it's okay to write an archetype. Just test it out, put it through that filter, challenge that character with relationships, because relationships can reveal a lot about a character. She also said, and gave some really good advice, that basically it doesn't matter if you try to make characters likable, because readers are still going to show up and read with their own biases. And I think, yeah, that's a pretty obvious one, but at the same time, I definitely needed that advice. Some good advice that I liked was putting a character between a rock and a hard place. I've always put this in my mind of when you're between a rock and a hard place, it's a tough time. I don't know, it's just, I've always given that more empathy than thinking there's no good options, and so what your character might do is not going to please everybody. And I think that stirs a lot of excitement in reading in a character who's flawed because they have no other choice, because their situation is just so tough. I love that. And kind of addition to that, and it goes quite well, she recommended to not judge your characters. And then she said, and this goes along with something that I'll say about Robin Hobb in a second, that every story is derivative. Someone had a question about not making a derivative story or derivative characters, and she was like, yeah, no, that's not really entirely possible. But there are ways to make it original or make it yours. Robin Hobb was also so wise in this. I'm thinking back and loving everything that they said and eating it up. She talked about putting a character in a first person spotlight lens of all of their thoughts. I also wrote down a quote. I don't know if it was word for word, but this is basically what she said. She said that a lot of writing for her happens in a part of her brain that she doesn't have access to. As she said, I love this, it's a little perilous to follow the characters, but she said it in a good way. They kind of go where you don't expect them to, where you don't plan for them to. So maybe don't outline so heavily, outline enough for a deadline, but not so much that you can't enjoy the character and where they're taking you. So I related a lot to that. I outline now. I actually did that recently, and it has helped me understand plot and structural stuff, but like the way to get there has been so not what I was expecting based on where the characters are like, actually, I'm gonna do this. She said like characters will just tell her no sometimes, and I love that. She also said that she'll sometimes let the characters step on stage and ask what if, or vice versa, have you ask what if to the characters. She quoted someone who basically said there is no wrong way to write your book, which sort of gives yourself freedom to write the best way for you. And then something that I quite liked, in addition to talking about derivative stories and how basically every story is derivative, she was saying that if there's a story that you like or that you think could be done better, or you want to have been done a certain way or in a different genre or whatever, to just write it. And she said that, and she said it's like filing off the serial numbers, but I can totally appreciate that, and I thought that was so like funny and wise and great. So I loved that panel. That was like on day one we were at that panel, and I was like, I'm gonna love this convention so much. There was a panel for like women in fantasy, and it was Shannon Hale, Robin Hobb, and Fonda Lee. Now I will definitely read all of these women more, but I have read Shannon Hale, and I grew up with Shannon Hale, so that was really special. She is a hilarious delight. There was such like a perfect balance of like perspectives. Fonda Lee kind of led and asked really important questions. Shannon Hale was prepared with her presentation. Like, she had so many facts. I relate to Shannon Hale in a way that I don't know if she would understand or think is silly, but she comes across as like the kind of feminist that maybe I am, where I didn't consider a lot of topics, and I grew up in a certain culture that's, I think, familiar to what she grew up in, if I'm being correct. I think she's from Utah. I know we have similar backgrounds, it seems like, and she was like, sort of like she'd made a lot of discoveries and was really excited to discuss them, especially feminism and any of the experiences she's had. Fonda Lee talked about how people have approached her and been surprised that she's a woman who wrote the books that she did, almost expecting for them to be so good or so intense or so well done, or just the way that they're written, what they're written about, to not be written by a woman. And Robin Hobb actually had some interesting perspectives that, based on her upbringing, her parents telling her you can achieve anything, that her dad showing her Sputnik out in space and saying you can go to the moon someday, kind of formed an opinion of herself very early that she could do anything and that she didn't have to be like a female author or any specific, she was just going to be a writer. Her advice I loved so much. She said basically not to put any qualifiers to yourself. This part made me tear up, and I just read it again and it made me emotional. She just said, no matter who you are, accept no limitations. But to read that again and to hear that was really powerful, because she wasn't countering the experiences of Fonda Lee and Shannon Hale. Both Hale and Lee have experiences of sexism, and Fonda Lee's experience with race and seeing characters that looked like her. Fonda Lee said something I'm remembering now, looking at the quote, that we sort of have an opportunity to write the stories about the silent or unheard women, like, or people in general, but like that so many women have been like on the back lines of a story, and we can tell that story, we can give that perspective. Shannon Hale made a lot of good points and did a lot of like statistics and things like that, but she talked about when we encourage boys, especially young boys in like school, to read books for boys that aren't largely about girls, we limit them and we limit their empathy, because stories are about empathy. That's one of their biggest powers, is that they are a tool for learning about other people who are different than you. Thinking Shannon Hale talking about how she read boys in fiction growing up, but she's one of the reasons I read a lot of powerful young women in books growing up, and I appreciate her for that. We're grown up training ourselves to see things through other people's eyes. Let's challenge ourselves now. If we feel like we didn't get good perspective of other people, then look through the lens of other people through books. That's what fiction can do. Fonda Lee said to never change your name, to keep your name. Do not do the letters and then your last name, to own it. And I mean, I appreciated that. I think there is so much power to that, and I love that. And then Shannon Hale said to tell your stories no matter who or where you are, make your voice heard. So I loved them. I loved them so much. Last little tidbit, but I won't get into much detail because it's mostly just like an emotional discussion. Me and my sister going to this panel, and it's the mental health in Sanderson's writing panel, but it talks so much about mental health in general, and I did cry during that panel. So I mean, that's not really a shocker. I'm a crier for sure, but I'm glad I brought tissues because a young woman stepped up to the mic to discuss how Sanderson writes in fantasy, and she talked about how she is a sensitivity reader. I think is probably the best description of her role, basically, for Sanderson's depiction of DID, or dissociative identity disorder, which is kind of version of what Shalon experiences. Definitely she's in a fantastical element, but the DID rep is definitely there, as far as I have come to understand, though it's not my experience. It just, that's what has been presented to me. That's my best understanding of it. But she's talked about something really beautiful that I think we can all remember. When we read characters like us, the reason that we're somewhat like compelled by them is that it's important to read characters that are like you too, and to have empathy for yourself, and that there is some power in having empathy for a character who is like you, even though you feel like you cannot have that kindness and understanding for yourself. And that is the power of fiction. And I think that's a huge power to Brandon Sanderson's works. I feel like I've been changed, and it just makes me want to be a writer even more, and to work with creative people in this capacity, not just as a writer, but just in all kinds of settings, hence me making this video. So yeah, that is like so much of what I learned. So much. I feel enlightened and tired and hungry, so I just appreciate you guys listening, and I'll see you nerds with another video on another day. Thank you so much.